Well, I remember how I heard of it. I was on the Missouri basketball team, and we were on a train for California, and en route, the news came out that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
We have witnessed this morning a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
It took a few days, I think, for it to sink into everybody's mind that we had our hands full.
And it seemed like a flash out of the blue.
My dad was very concerned about my being drafted. He thought that FDR had earlier talked at a meeting about not sending troops overseas, and he wanted to hold him to that.
I thought a war when I heard it. That's why I enlisted. Payback day.
It means an open declaration of war.
President Truman and Eisenhower grew up about 150 miles away from each other between Independence, Missouri and Abilene, Kansas. And they had a lot more in common than I think they realized.
They were cut from the same cloth, and they had very much the same values. He was born in Denison, Texas, and then they moved to Kansas when he was about 2. Abilene was his town. He regarded it as idyllic, but when you hear about some of the things that he went through, because he did come from the wrong side of the tracks, if you will, he took on a job to deliver ice to help with the family income because they were dirt poor. He would deliver to the wealthiest probably person in town, and he was not even allowed on the back porch. The help had to come out and get the ice from him. He let those things kind of roll off of his back and didn't let it stop him. I think his mother raised him that way. He just, he moved on. And Harry was much the same way.
He was born in Lamar, Missouri, tiny town. They spent a brief time in Grandview at my great-great-grandfather Young's farm in Grandview, and then moved to Independence, where my great-grandfather John Truman set up as a livestock trader and farmer. After high school, wanted to go to college or wanted to go into either West Point, preferably, or even Annapolis. He couldn't go to college. They couldn't afford, they'd had some financial troubles and couldn't afford to send him to college. So he went to work as a timekeeper, the paymaster on a railroad gang. They were building a spur of the Santa Fe Railroad near Kansas City. And eventually wound up working in 2 banks. And he was good at it. He got raises, got promotions. One of his roommates was Arthur Eisenhower, Ike's older brother, and worked there until he entered World War I.
During World War I, Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was in the United States Army. He was a West Point graduate, and he never got to go overseas during World War I. He instead was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, commanding the Army's new tank school at what they called Camp Colt. But Eisenhower, of course, wanted to go overseas, and when he finally was able to get orders sending him overseas to France, the war ended before he could be sent over. I think even the experience commanding Camp Colt, being in charge of this kind of very new, very young service with armor and tanks, I think that was really incredibly important to the formation of him as a soldier and as a leader. So he did not fight, he did not command troops in combat in World War I. Harry Truman did.
Fought through the war, brought everybody home in one piece, was an artillery captain. Went into the clothing business with his old canteen partner, his buddy, Eddie Jacobson. They were in basic training together, ran the only successful canteen, so they went into business together after the war. Did very well the first year. I think they made the equivalent of $750,000 with that little store, that little haberdashery. But then the post-war recession tanked them. After the haberdashery failed in 1921-22, Jim Pendergast, Tom Pendergast's nephew, friend of Grandpa's, went and told his uncle, he said, Harry Truman, he'd be great as a judge. You should run him for that. He's perfect. He's electable. And the way that Jim Pendergast put it was that my grandfather had been one officer in the war whose men hadn't wanted to shoot him. And Grandpa went into politics.
Kansas City and Jackson County in the 1930s and the 1940s, these were the days of machine politics, what they called, the Kansas City machine. And it was pretty much impossible to become a public servant or an elected official in those times without having support of the machine. And so Truman was handpicked by Tom Pendergast to become a county judge in Jackson County.
Eastern judge for 2 years, lost re-election, the only election he ever lost. Elected presiding judge for 2 4-year terms after that.
And he was handpicked to become United States Senator. And that forced Truman into a lot of ethical concerns. And so when he came to Washington, Truman was widely considered to be a corrupt tool of the Kansas City machine. When you look into Truman's life, it was more complicated than that.
He understood that he was part of a corrupt machine in Jackson County, but he was determined, and we know this from his writings, not to enrich himself, not to financially gain from his position, although he knew that he very well could do that. But Truman was, scrupulously honest and was determined to serve the public interest.
Pendergast once called him a sucker. In other words, he wouldn't take the bribes that were available either as a county judge or a United States Senator. He would draw a line in where he would agree to Pendergast's requests and where he would not.
In the election of 1940, when he comes back in 1941, that's when the Truman Committee is established. And it's established because Harry's on the Armed Services Committee, and he goes to the chair and says, we need to make sure that we're ready for this war, because this war is going to come.
It's important to remember that the U.S. Army was very small in 1940. There had been a very strong isolationist movement and an America First movement, as it was referred to in the 1930s. And the U.S. was really woefully unprepared for World War II.
He was an aide to MacArthur in the Philippines. He apparently had quite a bit of strategic know-how.
And then, fast forward to the early days of World War II, as General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, is recognizing the incredible organizational and administrative talent in Dwight Eisenhower. That sets Eisenhower on the path, of course, to get his first star and then his second star and then his third and fourth in very rapid succession, and ultimately be appointed as the Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy invasion.
And what got Harry Truman really catapulted into the upper reaches of the political landscape, was his service on what was referred to as the Truman Committee, or the Senate Committee to investigate the National Defense Program.
He started this committee in early 1941. He took the taxpayers' money and how it was spent very, very seriously. And so when he was getting these letters from some of his constituents in Fort Leonard Wood telling him that money was being wasted, contractors soaking the government for 2-3 times what they had made before the war, Truman took that seriously. And he cared deeply to see that the public's money was spent wisely. And I think that was the driving force that motivated him to say, hey, let's take a look at this. Let's investigate this. He developed a healthy suspicion of the military and its budget that would serve him well in the White House.
The day of Pearl Harbor was a Sunday, and my uncle had picked up my siblings and taken them to church at Sycamore Congregational Church. And of course, everybody was all abuzz about Pearl Harbor and what that would mean and how awful that was. And one of my grandparents, perhaps, or anyway, it was quoted as saying, it's like your parents are fighting. One of them is Japanese and the other is American. And it was just awful.
We expect to eliminate the danger from Japan, but it would serve us ill if we accomplished that and found that the rest of the world was dominated by Hitler and Mussolini. So we are going to win the war, and we are going to win the peace that follows.
There was this executive order 9066, which was, I guess, put on telephone poles and things in the neighborhood that said all people of Japanese descent must report to someplace. Topaz was one of 10, I think, concentration camps built for Japanese Americans right at the onset of World War II. The country was fearful of the Japanese more than the Germans because there were more people who looked German and not very many people who looked Japanese.
I applied at North American and they sent me to training school, which is where I met my partner that I had all the way through. All the time we worked together, we worked on the left bomb bay of a B-25. She was the riveter on the outside, and I was the bucker on the inside, which means that you hold an iron bar in your hand and you follow the riveter. You have to have a rhythm to it, or it doesn't work. We were pretty good. At least we thought we were. You have to remember that all the propaganda was on winning the war. And all around that plant, there were signs, electronic signs showing how many planes we built last month, how we're doing this month, you know. It was almost a race.
Everybody had something to do with it. Not only the military, but everybody at home. People working in all the plants, making all the ammunition, making all the tanks, planes, all your defense industries. They're just as important as the guy with the gun.
Your reporter, George Hicks of the ABC.
Our own ship has just gave its warning whistles, and now the flak is coming up in the sky. Looks like we're going to have a night tonight. Get it there, boys! Another one coming over. And a cruiser right alongside of it, pouring it up. Something burning is falling down through the sky. And circling down, maybe a hit plane.
Two of the architects of the operation kept a watchful eye on proceedings.
People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Together we shall achieve victory.
The letter of responsibility on D-Day, he dated it July 5th. And to me, that's somebody under a tremendous amount of stress. There have been other explanations for it, but I think that's what happened. I mean, he wrote it that night. I actually met the guy that wore a number 23. There was a fairly famous picture of the two of them together, and Granddad's looking very, very intense, and he's looking like this, you know. And finally, when Granddad would have been 100 years old, the guy was on the USS Eisenhower, and we had a celebration for Granddad on that day, and he was number 23. And I said, "Oh, you're number 23. Who, you know, I have seen your picture all of my life. And what in the world was he saying to you that night? Because he's so intense and all that." And he says, "Oh, no, he was talking to me about the fishing in Saginaw." But that's how much he could compartmentalize, and this was a cast apparently. His idea, that particular moment, was he wanted to convey to the troops what they were fighting for. So he was talking about the fishing in Saginaw. He was talking about the homes. He was talking about the kids and all that. That's what he did that night. He didn't talk strategy.
Everybody loved him. Everybody loved him. Just like they loved Churchill.
My mother had asked me to take typing in high school, freshman in high school. As it turned out, that baby saved my life, because when we got to the Battle of the Bulge in Europe, I was one of 3 of 109 men in our company who was not able to go to the front. We were back about 30 miles from the front, where it was probably 80 to 90% death rate for our company.
Through a grim and bleak period of several weeks, the enemy, supported by the most devastating of weather conditions, isolated and assaulted Allied forces.
Christmas Eve, 1944, just a few months before the end of the war, we were ready to go over to this little town up in northeast France. Each truck had a machine gun mounted on the rear of the truck. It was going to go through enemy territory. Sperry, the sergeant yelled out, "Man, that machine gun on our truck." A machine gun, I think I've seen one in a picture somewhere in movies. I had no idea that there was going to be any involvement with me in a machine gun and all my records and all these things. It's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. So I said, I don't know anything about a machine gun. You all you just need to sit in the seat. Here's the trigger. If we ran into enemy fire, I was to man this machine gun. Well, I guess I could do that. I don't know. But I said, afterwards, I thought we were supposed to win this war. That's why the first thing that came to my mind, how can I possibly take over a machine gun? And how are we going to win this war? That was terrible.
I said, "Hey, Mac, where's the front?" And he looked at me with an absolutely blank face and just said, "You're on it." So then I knew I was on it.
Granddad was going through, stopping the Nazis, but he didn't realize the Holocaust was happening. He was shocked when he found the camps.
Well, Eisenhower came to look it over and said he wanted all that documented. Said no one will believe this 50 years from now. And he made the townspeople bury all these people that were stacked up 6 feet deep.
I think it was so unbelievable to him. Your brain will only comprehend so much. I think it was so unbelievable to him that he felt the need to record it because he had to witness it. And so should everybody else, because somebody would say it was propaganda someday.
When we liberated Elam, the camp outside of Hanover, the rear echelon troops did what they're supposed to do, which is to investigate and look at things. But where our job was to fight and to push forward. And so by the end of that day, we were on the other side of Hanover. We didn't think anything about it. The one thing I did remember about it, and I do remember it to this day, was the smell. The smell of that place, I've come to think of, I'm pretty sure it's the smell of pure evil. As days went by, information worked its way forward about what it was. We'd heard, and I knew there was an abusive affair. I had no idea it was organized murder. Our tanks left a lot to be desired. but we had so many of them we won. I mean, the German guy told me, he said, well, we ran out of ammunition before you ran out of tanks. So really, he was telling the truth.
So we got over to Berchtesgaden, and that's where the center of the German government was, Hitler's office. And so I went in there right off to check it out to see if I could liberate anything. There was nothing left in his office, but in his hallway there was something that looked like a hope chest, which I lifted the lid on and discovered it was half full of Der Fuhrer's stationery. So I promptly liberated that and sent it home.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
I'm speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They and the women who have so ably assisted them constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe.
The West is free, but the East is still in bondage to the treacherous tyranny of the Japanese. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East.
Well, Jim and I went to boot camp together, and we went aboard ship together. And he was assigned to one gun mount, and I was assigned to another one. And our bunks were, mine was closer to where his quarters station was, and his was closer to where mine was. So we talked about seeing if we could switch places on the gun mounts. But before we got switched, I got a chance to go into the radar, and which I did. And Jim never did switch. And that one radar they came, it's when they got through and hit that gun mount and wiped out all the crew. I did write to his folks and tell them what happened to him, and they were grateful. And I got a letter back, and they thanked me very much.
I was just interested in being where some of the action was, which was probably foolhardy because where I was, nobody was shooting at me because my position was plotting where things were going on, but I was not in any way in harm's way. And if I got with the Fifth Fleet, that was very likely going to change. And that's where I went, was from Guam to Okinawa. The Fifth Fleet was going to lead the assault on Japan.
Anyone that was close to Franklin Roosevelt could see that this was a dying man. Whoever they nominated in 1944 very likely would become president of the United States, and that Franklin Roosevelt would not survive his fourth term. And that was apparent to everyone, I think, except Franklin Roosevelt. He tended to be sort of, I think, ambivalent about the question of his running mate. But Truman reluctantly agreed to be the nominee as vice president in 1944.
A job that he did not want. He often said the joke was there was a woman who had 2 sons. One became a sea captain, the other became vice president of the United States. Neither one of them was ever heard from again. He didn't want that job. And then, of course, FDR died on April 12th, 1945, and he became president.
Vice President Harry S. Truman takes the oath of office on April 12th, 1945, and succeeds to the presidency. At Hyde Park, New York, it is a soldier's funeral, with all honors to the nation's departed commander-in-chief.
I think by the time Truman became president, the World War II was well on the way to being won at that point. Eisenhower had led the successful D-Day landings and was, well on the way to winning the war in Europe. And as with many times throughout the war, Americans were writing into Truman. They were writing to him from Hanford, Washington, or Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they were saying, Senator Truman, they're buying up land all over the place. They're spending money like water out here. There's a giant thing going on here, and something funny is going on. A couple of times during the war, Truman sent an investigator out to, notably, Hanford, Washington. 3 days later, George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, shows up in Truman's office and said, basically, there's a big giant project going on here, but it's top secret, and we need you to back off, and we need you to leave it alone. And Truman honored that request, and he left the project alone. Strangely, that was to his detriment later when he became president, because Franklin Roosevelt had not told Truman very much at all, if anything, about the Manhattan Project. Truman had to be brought up to speed very quickly within the first weeks of his presidency.
The case in June of 1945 with President Truman was a very important meeting on June 18, which actually was the same day that he met Dwight Eisenhower for the first time. He had a dinner in honor of Eisenhower and presented him a Distinguished Service Award. But in this meeting I'm referring to, Eisenhower was not present. It was the same day, though, June 18. There was a warning that was issued from Potsdam, but it was in much more vague terms. Called for the surrender of Japan, or they would face prompt and utter destruction, was the term that was used, issued from Potsdam in July of 1945.
Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
The military figures around him almost unanimously advocated for the use of the atomic bomb.
He wanted advice on how to use it. The general consensus was, yes, this could shorten the war. It will hopefully forestall an invasion of mainland Japan. At the time, it was presented to him, and he thought that this was a way to shorten the war and save lives. And on both sides, he often said, save American lives, save Japanese lives.
He had been an artilleryman in World War I. I think Truman, with only partial understanding of what this new weapon was, saw the atomic bomb as another weapon, basically a big gun, basically the ultimate artillery piece. And his main concern was, will it work? And there was some uncertainty about that.
The idea bothered him, using that weapon. The idea of dropping a bomb on a city and killing people bothered him, certainly. But if it would shorten the war and save lives, it was the decision he was prepared to make. It's not taken lightly at all.
During that time, my father and grandfather shared a room together. Daddy had been out and about, and he came in, and the room was completely dark, and Granddad was sitting there, and he was like, whoa, and he turned on the light and saw Granddad there, and he was really surprised, and he said, Daddy, are you all right? And Granddad said, something incomprehensible is going to happen tomorrow, and I cannot tell you what it is. And quite frankly, he had a glass of bourbon, and he was cold sober. It was so incomprehensible to him.
So when we issued the ultimatum to Japan to surrender, the only answer we got was to go to the devil. And still there was no reaction. We learned later that the Japanese cabinet met, and finally there were enough who agreed to surrender to split the cabinet in half. One half in favor of surrender,
the other determined to fight on. In this spirit, the emperor was finally called on to give his opinion, an unprecedented move. He didn't want his people to die any more than he wanted to surrender. Yet the military was so strong, they still wouldn't notify us of their capitulation. So we had to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki. That did it. The dropping of the atom bombs was the only sensible thing to do. It was the only thing to do.
We knew that it was going to be a horror fighting for Japanese. They would do anything but surrender.
There was vast relief on the forces in the Pacific, all over the Pacific, that the dropping of the atomic bomb had spared all of us. It saved me, and that it's not just saved me, but it also saved the Japanese.
I think we all took the position that he was a hero. We knew that we would not be having to go to Japan. I think immediately that we heard, it was an eruption. Matter of fact, the vibration from the yelling is amazing. The ship didn't sink.
I was so filled with joy, I can't explain it to you. My life was granted back to me because I knew I'd survived in Europe 171 consecutive days of full engagement with the enemy, okay? You run out of chances. You really do. Guys run out of chances.
It was a pragmatic decision that he felt he needed to be made. And I think that it was a terrible thing, but I do not fault him for doing it.
I know Eisenhower was critical of that decision because he thought Japan would surrender anyway. Again, Truman was facing some pretty heavy predicted casualties in an amphibious invasion of the Japanese home island. So, how could you, in Truman's mind, how could you look at mothers and fathers and wives of soldiers who died in an invasion like that, and knowing that you had a weapon that could have prevented that invasion from ever having to take place? So I think President Truman had a lot of pressure on him as well, but I know Eisenhower was troubled by the use of the atomic bomb on Japan at the end of the war.
Dwight Eisenhower did not advocate for its use. In fact, he thought it should not be used. But Eisenhower was not consulted on the decision, and it's puzzling, I think, to people why. And I think the main reason was that Eisenhower was the European theater general, whereas people like Douglas MacArthur and others were on the Pacific theater. As I say, this meeting in June 18, this big strategy meeting, I mean, Harry Truman meets Eisenhower for the first time. It'd be very possible to include him in this meeting, but he does not in June of 1945. But Eisenhower, this shows the man of courage that he is, gave unsolicited advice. He mentioned it at Potsdam. He came to the Potsdam conference with President Truman and offered the opinion, by all accounts wasn't even asked about it directly, and said, Mr. President, this is July of 1945, just weeks before the bomb is actually used. I don't think it's necessary to use the bomb. In his view, Japan was already a defeated nation, and that the U.S.'s moral standing would go down in the eyes of the world if we were to use this weapon. And from what he understood about it, Eisenhower was just appalled by it and felt that it was just a terrible weapon that could potentially lead to a nuclear world and potentially a nuclear war. And so that was Eisenhower's opinion. He expressed that to his son, John. He felt a depression, is the word I've read, a depression over this subject. And felt deeply about it. Although ironically, years later, nuclear weapons would become a very important part of Eisenhower's foreign policy as president.
A lot of the rethinking of this happened afterwards because of the result, the destruction, the death, the radiation, and people began to back off. Well, no, I didn't think we'd have that many people killed, or I don't think that weapon was necessary. People started to distance themselves from it. He once told Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, "Has anybody been giving you trouble about using that weapon?" And Tibbets said, "No, sir." And Grandpa said, "Well, if they do, You tell him it was my decision, not yours. You were following orders. So he took and kept responsibility for that decision. Eisenhower said it about D-Day. He said, I'm responsible for that. If it fails, the fault is mine. I've organized this. My grandfather said the same thing about the atomic bombings. That's my decision. I take responsibility for that.
We ran much higher casualties on the Japanese in our fire bombings than we did with the atomic bomb. But the atomic bomb was all at once, thump. So that shock value, just the unbelievable, unimaginable impact all at one time.
When you saw the pictures and the films, what damage it did, it gave you a funny feeling. My God, the destruction of that thing, and the looks of the people and the cities and everything over there was horrible. But I thought it was a good maneuver for the United States to get this war over with. It wasn't pleasant to do, but I think it was the thing to do.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment. General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. The proclamation of VJ Day must await upon the formal signing of the surrender terms by Japan.
I stood watch several times in a director who had a big scope for fire control. And this friend of mine was up there on duty, and he invited me up to sit and watch with him on the big scope, and then the binoculars. We'd take turn back and forth. And I could reach out and almost touch them guys with that big scope. I even saw two guys in white Navy clothes come down and put stuff on the table and move stuff around to get ready for things to sign.
The war was over, and everyone was happy. The war was over, and there was going to be no more bombings, no more going down the air raid shelters.
When we got to New York, everybody in New York City seemed to be up there on the docks cheering, waving flags, yelling, singing, and we were just absolutely enthralled to know that we were not going to go to Japan. And you can't imagine how happy we were and how happy the people of New York City were when we got there.
From the first day to the end, there was never any doubt in the mind of any American that I knew that we were going to win. Never, ever entered into our imagination. We could lose our lives, we could lose our units, we could lose a lot of things, but we weren't going to lose the war.
Winning the war meant that I would be able to return to the kind of life that I had anticipated before the war ever came along.
As you get older, you realize there's somebody's sons in those planes that are being shot down. And they really weren't our enemy. They're just being told what to do, And I felt that way after I lost my brother.
Winning the war would mean peace. And if you don't win the peace, you haven't won the war.
You read my grandfather's letters to my grandmother from the front in World War I. He was all for grinding Germany into the dust. I mean, he actually said it. Let's just take everything they have. Let's, kill the officers, with the politicians, whatever. He was really angry at the end of the war. Well, of course, a quarter century later, Now you've got Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and World War II is ending. He wasn't going to make the same mistake, hence the Marshall Plan, NATO as a bulwark against the Soviets. All of that bringing peace and stability to all of Europe. And of course, at that time, General Eisenhower thought the same thing. I mean, they were in lockstep, I think, on that one.
Wars never settle problems. They only create new ones. When World War II ended, we had devastated countries from one end of the world to the other. The thing we did then was to set up in every country a program known as the Marshall Plan. We fed the countries in Europe that were starving. We furnished all the things that were necessary to restore Europe and make it self-supporting. If it had not been for the Marshall Plan, I don't know what would have happened. We all, in all probability, would have seen the people of Europe rebelling and bringing on a situation which would have pleased the Russians immensely. I did not want that to happen.
And we went to the 1st Infantry Division in Germany, and what we did, and the other countries, build Germany back up. I was a young staff sergeant, and Truman integrated the whole military. The colonel called us all inside this conference building. He said, we're not going to have any trouble. We're going to stick together and work together. And that's it. So, you know, everybody treated everybody right, and it worked.
He won re-election in 1948 despite that, despite desegregating the military and desegregating hiring in the United States government. So he basically opened jobs up. And this from a man who had all throughout his life used racial epithets, and not only for black people, but anybody you could think of, and just the way he talked, the environment that he lived in. But the basic issue of human rights did not escape him.
For years and years, the white people had been practically treasonable for the simple reason that they wouldn't give all the citizens of the country civil rights. The whites, therefore, had been disregarding the Constitution.
The two men remained cordial and even friends through much of Truman's presidency. Weirdly, in 1947, Truman suggested that he himself might step aside if Eisenhower wanted to become president.
You know, you run as president and I'll be your vice president. And Eisenhower turned him down politely. I think he, on more than one occasion, made that offer. And Eisenhower turned him down and then ran as a Republican. And Mary Jean Eisenhower told me years ago, I asked her, why did he go Republican? And she said, basically, he thought the Democrats had been in the White House too long. So he thought it was time for a change. Of course, he had no political affiliation before that as a soldier.
But they remained on good terms all the way up until the election of 1952, in which Truman was stepping aside, Adlai Stevenson would be the Democratic candidate, and Eisenhower would be the Republican candidate. This is the time of the Red Scare, of Joe McCarthy. McCarthy had been very critical of George Marshall, Truman's hero, Truman's friend as Secretary of State, and early on in the campaign, Eisenhower refused to denounce McCarthy. He refused to stand up for George Marshall, and Truman took that very, very personally. And that led to some hard feelings between the two that, in the nature of two very powerful people, one of whom held the office of the presidency, one of whom was running to replace him by criticizing his policies as president, their relationship went south and never fully recovered.
When Granddad started to become inaugurated, Truman told Granddad that he would like for him to pull Daddy from open combat in Korea, and he would like him to come to the inauguration. And Granddad kind of thought that was kind of a good idea. When he communicated with Daddy, Daddy said, absolutely not. I don't want to leave open combat to come to the inauguration. I can't. And so Granddad relayed that to Truman, and Truman did it anyway. He said, why did you do that to me? And he said, well, I didn't, your president did. And so that,
It is customary, and has become quite a custom,
for the outgoing President of the United States to have a breakfast for the incoming one called the inaugural breakfast. Mrs. Truman had prepared a very fine breakfast in the state dining room, and Mr. Eisenhower was supposed to come to that breakfast, which he didn't do.
During the 8 years of Eisenhower's presidency, Truman was not invited to the White House.
Again, they were great men, but they were capable of bitterness and pettiness, you know, and they could be sensitive. They both could be thin-skinned.
And Mary Jean and I have talked about this. You know, sometimes it's funny to us that the two of them got on each other's nerves so badly when they were both raised so much the same way with so much the same values.
In an oral history with Merle Miller that became the book Plain Speaking, Truman said, "No military man gives a damn about money. All they care about is how to spend it." So Truman shared Eisenhower's fears of the sort of huge power between the military and giant defense corporations. But Truman very strongly believed that these huge corporations and their relationship with the military was a concern. And it's not all that dissimilar from what Eisenhower would warn about at the end of his presidency.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
It was kind of prophetic on his part, but he saw a money-making war machine, and he was afraid people would get caught into it and that it would destroy us.
I mean, the reality is, and few people know this, except it's out there as public knowledge, frankly, what is now called the Kansas City National Security Campus. That is the official name of the Honeywell operation. Its purpose is to produce, on their website they say 80% of the non-nuclear components for all nuclear weapons that the United States develops. Back in the day, it produced probably about 100%. We're talking 1940s and 1950s. It's very, very significant in terms of what happens in Kansas City since. And, the National Security Campus, the Honeywell plant, is, such a huge continuing thing. That plant operates with between 7,000 and 8,000 employees on a daily basis, which makes it one of the largest manufacturing plants. But that makes it about twice the size in terms of employment of the General Motors plant here, for example. That's very significant. That's all part of the America that was transformed by the World War II experience. Because the United States is very different after World War II than it was before. World War I had nowhere near the impact on life in America that World War II did.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I think the story goes that he sat on one of the couches at Blair House after the funeral, after Kennedy's funeral, and he was really upset. And Truman came over and said, "Have you gotten a plate yet?" Meaning a buffet. And Granddad just kind of went, and he says, "I'll get you one." And that's how they ended up making up. They never really agreed or apologized, but they became friends again.
One of the things that we did with my grandparents for several years was visit Key West during our spring break, because my grandparents liked to go back down there. And we were with them in Key West when President Eisenhower died. And Grandpa got the news, and I remember him being visibly upset at hearing that President Eisenhower had died. So by that time, this was somebody for whom Grandpa, again, had a great deal of respect and was a friend, and he had just lost.
Both men are regarded as great presidents, or the near great category, by historians, by scholars, and by the general public. And part of the reason, I think, is because of the importance of the decisions that the men made at a critical time in our history, the largest war in human history. And both men were trying to help fix a broken world, whether it's the legacy of Israel in the Middle East, whether it's the role of the United States in the world, NATO, for example, which was created under the Truman presidency, in which Eisenhower served as supreme commander. These are momentous decisions, and they're timely decisions, and they're decisions that still resonate with us today.
And it is a remarkable thing that I think the quieting effect of this terribly dangerous weapon has had on the idea of an all-out total war.
I'm just glad no one has used it again. And I had hoped that the feeling that the bomb was out there would keep wars from breaking out. But of course it hasn't. They've just been little wars. And no war is little.
It's hard not to look back at an era when the entire nation came together in a bipartisan way to struggle against a common enemy. It's hard not to worry and be concerned when you see the toxicity and the divisiveness in Washington today. It's hard not to worry about whether the nation has the will to do that in this day and age.
History-wise, we've had our good guys and our bad guys, but we always have people who are able to provide our country with the leadership that it needed, and I'm confident that will always be the case.
I don't feel confident that it will remain the kind of country that we served. I'm sure the country itself will survive one way or another.
I'm confident about the future, but I think it's kind of shaky. I don't want to see us get into like a dictatorship, and that scares me a little.
Gotta say, I'm concerned, and I just think a lot of things are happening now that for me the country is not going the right way. I don't think.
Everyone was so patriotic. I wish I could say that everyone is patriotic now, over here, but they're not. Believing in your government and knowing they're doing the right thing for you, just the ordinary people, is a lovely thing. It's a lovely thing. And I think a lot of the people over here are missing out on something because they're too busy running other people down instead of building them up and helping them.
Who was it said about democracy that it's the worst form of government imaginable, except for all the others? It's flawed, it's a mess, but it's the best system that we have, the most universal system, the system that includes the most people. And we're always going to have the fascists. We're always going to have the dictators who want to jump up and make everybody do it their own way without getting any argument about it. So you have to have, the more democracy you have, the better off you are.
We must work to bring the nations of the world together. The best way we can do this, I've always believed, is to dedicate ourselves unswervingly to honest democratic principles. We must make the ideal of democracy increasingly brighter and more real.
We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow.
Grandpa was put at number 5, and Mary Jean Eisenhower and I, they sometimes in polls they switch places. So, we talk to each other. Okay, so whose grandfather's on top now? Well, I don't think that's fair. He's been there too long. I think it's my grandfather's turn.
Yeah.
On our first anniversary, my husband said to me, this is my second husband, he said to me, "Oh, I've got a surprise for you." He said, "Have you ever heard the song Mustang Sally?" And I said, "No." And I still haven't heard it.
I take lessons from this guy on YouTube, and I'll just show you quickly the different maneuvers. This is a forward fist roll, and you'll notice I switch ways as I go on my hands. Did you catch the way they switched?